So at this juncture, we have a single test for our app component, testing that component when it is in login mode. But of course, that is only half of the equation because our app component can also exist in registration mode. And when the component is in that mode, the user will see an additional confirm password field that they have to fill out. So in this lesson, let's practice once again writing a new test using React Testing Library. And rather than copying and pasting the syntax above, we're going to write everything from scratch just so that we can practice with this library again. So I'll begin by just shrinking the text on my screen. So now we can see the test suite as a whole. And I'm going to add another describe block right after the one here. This is my second nested describe block within the function for the app component. And this is another context or another scenario under which I am testing the component. Now, again, the describe blocks are totally optional, but I like to add them to provide context and explanations for the circumstances under which I am testing. So right here, I'll invoke describe. And this time around, we're testing when the user is in registration mode. Once again, I'll provide an arrow function as the second argument. And here I'll begin with an it function call. And this time around, we once again want to provide a description of what we're testing from a user-centric perspective. So once again, try to avoid details about your implementation. Try to avoid anything that involves JavaScript, right, or React. Try to describe the value of the test to the end user. So what is the form supposed to do when the user is in registration mode? We can say something like it registers account for user, and we can also say and alerts them, right? Maybe something that describes the message that the user will see. That I think is super helpful. There's no single right answer, right? It's up to us as developers to write whatever string we want. That's kind of the creative part of test writing. But obviously, if we can describe to another developer or to a product manager what the test is doing, that's ideal. Okay, so many parts of the test are going to be very similar. But remember, our component now is starting in login mode because we have the login mode state property set to true. So the first thing we're going to need to do after we render the component is to find the toggle switch at the top and simulate a click. And that should bring the component into the registration mode, the inverse of login mode. Notice that I am not trying to reach into the component state and modify login mode to be false. There were other libraries related to React testing, like Enzyme, where that was possible. And the reason React Testing Library doesn't like that is because it's reaching into component internals in a way that the user cannot. We want to interact with the component the exact same way the user in the browser will. So if our component is going to start out in login mode, we have to click the toggle to bring it into our registration mode. So right here, we'll once again begin by using our render function from React Testing Library. We provided our component. It's still going to be our app component, and we are going to provide that syntax with the actual component instantiation. So don't just provide app with the less than sign and the self-closing ending sign as well. Okay, so before we start looking for things like the input, I want to find this element right here. Now, this component is coming from another component library, right? We imported this using the React Switch NPM library. However, remember that React Testing Library will render the entire collection of components that we have. And you may also recall that if we don't know what we're working with, we can also ask React Testing Library to either output the entire content, or we can use a method like getByRole, provide it an empty string, and we'll see all of the available roles and what elements they belong to. So what I'm going to do here is once again just invoke the getByRole method with an empty string, save that and let our test suite run, and here's the output. We can ignore the failure and scroll all the way up, and here's the categorization of all of the roles and the elements that are associated with them. So this input, you'll notice, is coming from not our code, but from the switch component that we are using right here. We'll notice that this code looks a little unfamiliar, and that's because we didn't write it, but this is the internals of that switch component. It's an input with a checked attribute, a role attribute, a style attribute, a type attribute, etc. And you'll notice it actually has a manual role attribute inline set to switch, and that is actually its accessible role as well, because that role attribute inline explicitly assigns a role to that element. So that means we can search for the role of switch. So right here, I'm going to say I want to find the element with the role of switch, and I'm going to assign it to a const like mode switch. And if I save this, you can see our test is passing, which means React Testing Library is able to locate that switch. The next thing I want to do, of course, is to click on that switch, because that's going to toggle the form into registration mode. In order to click, we know that we use our user event object. It has a click method, and we pass in the element that we want to click on, which is our mode switch. That is the actual DOM element that we identified in the previous lesson. So now what I can do is actually invoke the debug method on my screen object to take a look at the HTML. And if I scroll up, we should see the appearance of our confirm password field. And you can see it is present right here, right? And if you called screen debug before you clicked on the toggle, you would not see this code, right? So that means the React component internal state updated and re-rendered, and now we have that input present. So now we are good to proceed through our expected flow. So we're going to find the email input, we're going to provide a value, we're going to find our password input and provide a value, and then our confirm password input and provide a value as well. So a lot of the code is going to be very similar to the test above. So let's just simply write it out. I don't want to copy and paste because I do want to practice with the syntax. So once again, we're going to define a constant called email input. And that is going to be using the getByRole method to query our DOM for an element with a role of text box. And that corresponds to inputs with a type of text. And to be more specific, I want to tell it that just in case there's multiple inputs of type text that satisfy that role of text box, I want to specifically look for the one with a label of email address, once again making that search case insensitive, so we don't care what the capitalization is. Okay, so the fact that we don't have a failure means everything is working fine. React Testing Library is finding that. So once again, just like above, I'm going to call the type method on my user event object, pass in my email input as the element I want to type into. The second argument is what I want to type. So once again, I'm going to provide a fake email address like test@email.com. Then what I want to do is query once again for the password. Now, very similarly to what I have above, we're going to write const password input, and we're going to say screen get by label text. And you'll notice this time around, regardless of whether I use password or as a regular expression or a string, we're actually going to get a little bit of an issue. Let me just provide the regex first to show you that if I try looking for anything that matches the text password, we're actually going to get a failure because we now have two elements that are satisfying this query, right? Our password input and our confirm password input both have a label that has the text password if we're not concerned about case sensitivity, right? So here's password. So React Testing Library is finding the input associated with that label text, and it's also finding this input associated with this label text. And that's because we're being intentionally very flexible by saying just look for password in any shape or form. But what I can do is be a little stricter by getting rid of regular expressions and passing in a regular string like password. So now what I'm saying is it literally has to be the label text password with a capital P, right? And that is only going to match the very first one we have right here. So when I save this, we can see that it's going to find it just fine because the label text of this input is going to be password and the label text of this input is going to be confirm password, the complete collection of those two words as a single string. So what we did here is we wrote a search query that was good enough to identify just one element, and it's this one right here. All right. So that's why I have to be very careful. I just have to make sure that I am locating the exact element that I'm looking for. So now that we have our password input, let's go ahead and type into it. So once again, user event.type. We want to type into our password input, and we want to do a password like Star Wars. The follow-up thing we want to do, of course, is now search for the confirm password input. So right here, I can say const confirm password input, and we could use get by label text again, and we could also provide a string right here of confirm password. That's totally fine, but if a regular expression works, then I think that's fine as well. So right here, I'm going to provide a case-insensitive regular expression of confirm password. So you might be curious, again, why am I using a string here but a regular expression here? It's okay to be more flexible here and not worry about case sensitivity because this is enough to uniquely identify just one element on the DOM that we want to target. A regular expression with the text password was insufficient right here, so I had to be a little bit more clever, a little more creative and stricter to literally look for password to narrow down from those two inputs just to my first one. But here, there's nothing going to conflict with the search term confirm password. Our first password field's labeled text of password is not going to match. Only our confirm password labeled text is going to match. So not caring about case insensitivity adds more flexibility while still allowing us to query for just one element on our DOM. Again, if you're going to use a string here and say confirm password literally with a capital C and a capital P, it's not the worst thing in the world. This is just a little bit more flexible. If, for example, tomorrow we change this right here to confirm password, right, that's going to allow our implementation to change while our test still passes. That's the benefit of case insensitivity, unless, as we saw, it makes it more difficult to query because it finds one too many results. So we have our confirm password input in our registration mode. We're going to execute the exact same logic. We're going to type into that, and it's up to us whether we want to type the exact same thing because it depends on what we're testing. Remember, our form is going to have different messages if the user does have matching passwords and if they do not. So in this scenario, I'll assume the happy path and assume that the passwords do match. So I will indeed populate the same password of Star Wars. So as a quick reminder, if I scroll up in our implementation, you can see right here in this logic, if we have a valid email and password and confirm password and the passwords match, we should see the text, thank you for signing up. That is our communication to the user. That is what provides value. So I'm going to do something very similar to the test above. I'm going to click on the button and then validate that the user sees the text that we expect. So once again, we're going to query for this submit button. So right here, I'm going to say const submit button. We're going to look for an element with a given role of button. There can be multiple elements that satisfy that role. So I'm going to clarify with the name property that I provide to this configuration object that I want the text of, well, actually this time around, it's not going to be log into account, right? Because we're actually altering the button text. As a reminder, if I scroll down, you can see right here on line 57, depending on the mode of the form that we are in, we are displaying a different text. So we're not going to see login into account in registration mode. We're just going to see register. So this is going to be searching for a button with a text of register. I'm going to make that once again case insensitive using regex. All right, and you can see we're still finding it. So now that we've located that button, we want to click it once again using user event, but now we want the click method and we provide the element we want to click on. In this case, it's our submit button. So now we've clicked the form and the last thing that's remaining is validating that we see the expected message. So once again, I'm going to say right here, const success message. We could also give it a different name like registration message if that provides more context, but I think this is fine. Once again, I'm going to use the getByText method to query our DOM for any element that has the given text. And I'm going to look for the text, thank you for signing up. That's exactly what we have on the right. Right? And then I'm going to say expect success message. I expect that DOM node to be somewhere in the document. I don't care what that DOM node is. I don't care whether it's an H1 or H2 or P. I just want this text to be on the screen because that's validating that the user is seeing what they should see given that they are in registration mode and they've given me an email, a password, and a matching confirmation password. So I'm going to save that. And you can see the test is passing. I just want to show you as well a quick failure. If, for example, I do not provide a matching password, like if this is Star Wars with an extra Z, well, then when we click the button, our validation will not work, and we're going to get this piece of state instead, passwords do not match, which means we're not going to be able to find our success message in the document. So we are validating through the user walking through this component the way that they would, or rather through our test walking through the component much like a user would, that we are delivering exactly the value that the user expects, right? So when they give us the same password, we should see this message. In case they don't, the test is working as expected. Now, it is worth writing a test for this scenario because it is another branch of logic, and we're going to take care of that in the very next lesson. But hopefully this has given you more practice and a better understanding of just how React Testing Library works and how we can interact with our component in different ways, especially if it defines different branches of logic as our app component does. Okay, that's all there is to cover in this lesson, so I will see you in the next one.